You may think it's a great idea to get two highly skilled and experienced people to contribute to the outcomes. Two heads are better than one, right? But it's just not true. In this modern era of enlightened inclusiveness, the pendulum has swung decisively from independent operating silos towards sharing and collaboration. Now, this has seen a resurgence in role sharing at all levels in organisations of all sizes. Collaboration is a critical ingredient to working successfully in complex organisations. But what happens when accountabilities are split to the point where they become opaque, confused, or misunderstood? From low-level part-time job sharing to co-CEOs of major global businesses, we witness the hazards of trying to share accountabilities. Humans just aren't particularly good at it for all sorts of reasons. Now, some of the higher profile co-CEO arrangements have crumbled fairly publicly in the last couple of years. So I thought it would be a good time to address the issue of role sharing and the impact that it has on performance. If you just want your people to be able to come into work and feel good about contributing in a team environment with their peers, hey, nothing wrong with that, and shared accountability is just the ticket. But if it's performance you're after, it's super unlikely that you'll find that in a structure where accountabilities are spread across multiple people. I firmly believe the old saying, too many cooks spoil the broth, and it's a principle we need to apply in business. Let's start with a look at job sharing. Why was it even invented? Now, job sharing is defined as regular part-time work where two people share the accountabilities of one position and simply split the hours. And this became reasonably popular as a way to offer flexible working arrangements. For example, it gave a path to re-employment for new mothers who wanted to return to the workforce, but could only do so on a part-time basis while still meeting the demands of their families. Now, for this reason, it was a really big step forward in the quest for gender equity. For two individuals sharing a single role, the accountabilities are the same and they're simply divided by the allocation of time. Now, for this reason, they're suited more to lower level roles that don't require quite as much accountability. As the level and the breadth of accountability increases, the effectiveness of job sharing declines. Now, this is because the two people would have to ultimately agree on any decisions that were made. Either that, or the more dominant person would simply get their way. Add to this the fact that humans are pretty resourceful, and everyone would learn how to play mum off against dad pretty quickly. You know how it goes, right? Oh, I need an answer on this issue, but Emma's a real hard ass, so I'm going to wait until Thursday, because Marty's going to be in the role on Thursday, and I've got a much better chance of convincing him. The accountability, though, clearly lies with the role, but it requires excellent communication between the job sharers. Job sharing arrangements can also be unwieldy and difficult to manage, and they're more likely to be more costly as well. For example, things like training and development and performance management, well, they have to be duplicated. And think about the practicalities of working out who's performing and who isn't. Now, when an awesome result is achieved by the two people in a shared role, you'd sort of have to wonder, did one of the individuals benefit from a free rider effect? Equally, when a disaster occurs, where was the breakdown? And I believe that these things actually do matter. So, how would you overcome that all care, no responsibility culture that joint accountabilities tend to create? Well, the literature on this indicates that job sharing took off pretty well in the public sector. Government organisations really embraced it. But the private sector was, to quote the phrase, slow to follow. This probably indicates a basic lack of belief in the efficacy of job sharing as a solution to a business problem. These days, we have a much better understanding of the need for personal flexibility. So look, I suspect there's going to be less requirement for a full-time role to be split between multiple individuals in the future. The concept of job sharing is probably being crowded out by more flexible arrangements that are widely available anyway. I think it's now much more likely that a set of objectives and accountabilities is simply going to be defined into separate roles. Now, with job sharing, you've got two people sharing one full-time role. So at least the role accountability is relatively clear, despite some of the other issues I just covered. But having two full-time people splitting the same role is even more problematic. Enter the co-CEO. I first came across this years ago. I was a chief information officer, and the company I worked for was a major customer of software giant SAP. At the time, SAP was the largest global supplier of business management software. So in 2010, I met with Jim Hagemann-Snabe, one of the newly appointed co-CEOs of SAP. Jim was based in Europe, and the other half of the CEO Act, Bill McDermott, was based in the US. Jim was an internal appointment and Bill was an external appointment. Now, as Jim described it to me, his accountabilities were focused on the product itself and the future technology roadmap, while McDermott's role was focused on the customer. They both had global accountabilities for the markets and the 50,000 odd staff who worked for SAP at the time. Now, this arrangement lasted for about 3 years before Jim announced that he was going to step down from the co-CEO role. I tend to get a bit curious about this stuff. And even though the real story rarely emerges in public, I went looking for some earlier articles in the hope that I'd see some indication that the arrangement wasn't all champagne and roses right from the get-go. Now, I found a brief Bloomberg interview on YouTube, which was conducted in April of 2010 with McDermott and Hagemann-Snabe. The co-CEO structure had been in place for just over a year at this particular point. So I looked for signs that might portend what was to come. Well, watching the interview, I noticed a couple of important things. From the amount of talking time that each received, and it wasn't a huge amount, it was 60-40 in favour of McDermott, to the body language and overall demeanour of the two co-CEOs. It was pretty obvious to me that McDermott was the dominant force in the shared CEO office. He even said at one point early on in the interview, "Oh, Jim's got a great story about Japan that he must tell you." And the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor goes to, right? So, no surprise that a couple of years later, Jim vacated the role to make Bill McDermott the sole CEO. Now, I don't want to say that a hugely successful global organisation like SAP could possibly be slow learners. But when McDermott retired in 2019, SAP once again appointed co-CEOs, Jen Morgan and Christian Klein. Morgan and Klein were described respectively as a sales superstar and an internal wunderkind. Well, of course, SAP is a German company. But this particular tilt at co-CEOdom lasted barely 6 months. Fortunately, this time, SAP could point to the pandemic as the catalyst for backtracking on the co-CEO model. According to the SAP chairman, going back to a single CEO was to ensure strong, unambiguous steering of the company. Amen. More recently, we've seen Bret Taylor, who was also formerly chair of Twitter, leave his role as co-CEO at Salesforce, another global software giant. Salesforce was founded in 1999 by Mark Benioff and 3 others. 2 years later, in 2001, Benioff was named CEO and chairman. Now, as an aside, I don't particularly like the combined chair-CEO role either, purely from a governance perspective. Whereas it might reduce friction in decision-making, I think it gives one individual too much influence over proceedings. The whole point of a board is to oversee strategy and risk and provide some governance oversight. If the CEO also controls the board, the likelihood of one person doing as he or she pleases without an appropriate level of oversight and control increases dramatically. But I digress. Taylor came to Salesforce as part of its acquisition of Quip in 2016. Now, initially, Taylor was Chief Operating Officer, and later he was promoted to the role of co-CEO. This looks like it was probably an attempted succession plan, and Taylor was being set up as a likely successor to Benioff. But if you believe the reports in the media, Mark Benioff couldn't let go. Taylor supposedly oversaw 10 top execs running 5 key areas: finance, operations, engineering, staffing, and marketing. So this is the classic COO role with a few notable add-ons. Now, insiders say that the two CEOs were stepping on each other's toes and not staying in their lanes. Apparently, Taylor was focused largely on profitability and Benioff more on growth. And the other problem was that deep division started to emerge in the executive team based on the reporting lines. This wasn't Benioff's first bite of the cherry either. He had Keith Block as co-CEO in 2018, but that arrangement only lasted 18 months. And the co-CEO structure isn't the only way to completely confuse accountabilities at the top of an organisation. Some companies have a separate president and CEO. It's never obvious who does what. Others have an executive chairman and a CEO. The executive part of that title indicates a management accountability. And I've also seen executive directors stumble all over managing directors' accountabilities. Let's face it, the boards that put these arrangements in place aren't stupid. So perhaps they want to get the benefit of two people with exceptional and complementary skills. Perhaps they want to keep two really good people when one might otherwise resign. Perhaps they're looking for a soft landing on their succession plans. But the intent is incredibly hard to make work in practical terms. It's not the boxes on a structure chart that make the most difference. It's the white space in between the boxes that does. The big problem with job sharing, co-CEOs and other similar structures is that accountabilities aren't crystal clear. Who's accountable for specific decisions and results in a world where overlaps are part and parcel of modern org structures? Even if you separate the roles by having different reporting relationships that seem to clearly delineate accountabilities, human nature is to form strong bonds and identity around your proximate peers and immediate team. It can turn pretty quickly into an us or them, and the power struggle begins. We can even see this play out with two executives at the peer level who have clearly defined accountabilities. Now, I've experienced this more than once. A situation where two executives are fighting for that white space between their roles, and the power struggle consumes them. Most of us aren't going to have to decide whether or not to establish a co-CEO relationship, but we all need to clearly identify who's doing what in our team, regardless of its size or the number of levels. So let me give you my 3-step process for how to think more clearly about structure when you find yourself in the position of having to define it. The first step is to make sure you get the order right. Strategy, then structure, then people. We have a tendency to think mostly about the people and how accountabilities can best be divided between them. And yes, there's definitely a need for that informal tailoring of roles based on who's occupying them. But you need to think through the issues in the right way. What are you trying to achieve? What's your strategy? That's first. Next, what structure do you need to put in place in order to deliver that strategy? What roles and accountabilities need to be created to execute effectively? And finally, who can you put in these roles to have them performed brilliantly? The second step is to make sure that there's one and only one name next to every major deliverable. Splitting an accountability between more than one person is a slippery slope. And this is often done in the name of collaboration. Oh, well, Greg and Sally are both accountable for that deliverable. They're collaborating. Pig's ass. That's how gaps and overlaps develop in the first place. One and only one name. One head to pat, one ass to kick, and they both belong to the same person. Then you encourage that person to collaborate with others. But if you try and do that the other way around, it doesn't actually work. Starting with an environment of well-meaning collaboration and then trying to superimpose strong accountability over the top of that is an order of magnitude harder than starting with single point accountability and then fostering collaboration. The final step in this 3-step process is to remain doggedly focused on outcomes. The principle of entropy in thermodynamics tells us that things tend to naturally seek a state of disorder. And if you do nothing different in the way you lead, people are going to tend to fall back to the loose indiscipline of shared accountability. So when you're trying to gauge progress and performance, you have to look at delivered value, not activity. You've heard me talk about this ad nauseum. When it comes to your team structure, if you focus on activity, you won't even be able to see the ill effects of the shared accountabilities, let alone resolve the gaps and overlaps. Those debilitating inefficiencies are going to remain hidden under the careful protection of your lovely, all care, no responsibility people. And even really good people will happily hide behind vague and nebulous accountabilities in order to avoid the harsh gaze of performance scrutiny. To wrap this up, even in situations where it might seem like a good idea to share a role, I would strongly advise you to rethink that. It's a lesson that the tech sector seems to be relearning frequently, and that looks just a little bit too much like Groundhog Day to me. You may think it's a great idea to get two highly skilled and experienced people to contribute to the outcomes. Two heads are better than one, right? But it's just not true. The few pros are massively outweighed by the many cons. So get the structure right first and make sure that you have a single point of accountability for every major deliverable. Every decision and all resourcing has to gravitate to that single point so that the individual is empowered to deliver. This is the foundation of execution excellence. So look, don't mess with it. It isn't easy, of course, otherwise everyone would be doing it. But if you can manage to get this right, then you can take the next step, which is to make sure that you don't have any passengers on the team. And this takes real commitment as a leader, but it's something you're more than capable of if you truly believe how great the benefits are for everyone involved.